Good afternoon and welcome, or good morning to our friends on the West Coast. Welcome to this latest iteration of the knowledge sharing series for the Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative program. My name is John Conley, Senior Program Officer with the LISC Safety and Justice Team, and I will be your moderator for this event. I have a number of individuals, as you can see, joining me here today. First, Samantha Reinerson, Program Manager with the National Policing Institute, our fellow training and technical assistance provider for this program. Samantha, would you like to say a few introductory comments?
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just excited to see you all here joining us today for this event, and want to thank you all for being great partners with us in the Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative program, as well as our colleagues here at LISC. So, John, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Samantha. Also joining us is Juliana Palmer, Policy Advisor for the Bureau of Justice Assistance at the Department of Justice, the funder for this particular program. And so we thank Juliana for her partnership and leadership and support for this program. And Juliana, welcome any opening comments you'd like to provide as well.
Thanks, John. Just wanted to say good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I know I'm looking forward to hearing from the LISC team on this topic, so we hope that you enjoy it and appreciate all of the work that went into this event, John. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Juliana. In just a moment, I will introduce your co-presenters and the agenda, but first, let me begin by sharing my screen and going through a few housekeeping items. The first, this project is supported by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Office of Justice Programs at the Department of Justice. The findings, however, and opinions and conclusions of the upcoming presenters are their own and do not reflect the opinions of the Department of Justice. Just a few event logistics. This event is being recorded. We will be providing a survey link to provide feedback from the field surrounding this event, and we really do value feedback from the field so that we can enhance future offerings in terms of knowledge sharing events, rural roundtables, and other offerings to the field. Individuals that are joining are muted, but we do ask for questions or comments to be provided in the chat or question feature, and we'll do our best to answer those over the course of the presentation, and we're also going to hopefully save some time for question and answer at the end of the event.
Yeah, John, I'm not seeing a screen share yet.
Oh, I'm sorry, pardon me. So sorry about that.
There you go.
So here is our acknowledgement slide. Apologies for the technical glitch there. Here are our event logistics and our agenda. So we'll start off with a discussion around place and crime by my good friend and colleague, Matt Perkins, and the relationship between place and crime and how that can provide support to sites as they think through their work. And after Matt's conversation, he'll be followed by Tom Wyatt, longtime subject matter expert partner with the LISC Safety and Justice Team, and he'll walk through CPTED, or Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design Principles, which can be another set of tools in the toolbox for sites as they think through crime reduction and crime prevention. And then again, followed by question and answers. And we will be providing a copy of this deck along with a recording of the presentation once that is available. So with that, happy to then turn it over to Matt Perkins to walk us through an introductory conversation around place and crime.
Thanks, John, and hello, everybody. I'm Matt Perkins, as he said. He wasn't lying. I'm a program director with LISC's National Safety and Justice Team, and by way of background, started my career at the COPS office at DOJ, and since the mid-90s have really been focusing on place-based interventions and community-based interventions in crime, including quite a bit of work on crime prevention through environmental design, starting in the mid to late 90s in public housing developments. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes. It's going to be fast. as I go through the slides, because I found that it's a very visual thing to learn. So we'll try and provide illustrations when we talk about CPTED. And then Tom will get more into details about some specific projects. But want to make sure you have the grounding in why we know this works, and theoretically why CPTED approaches work as we begin. And so let's go, John. Next slide. All right. So crime prevention through environmental design really has its foundations in concepts around situational crime prevention, specifically in the crime triangle, which you see to your right. And essentially what the crime triangle postulates is that for any criminal event to take place, three things have to come together. There needs to be a target or victim, a motivated offender, and a place or an environment in which that crime can happen. That could be online, it could be cyberspace. Often it's a physical space, though. And some things to keep in mind in terms of the importance of place in criminal events, right? Throughout my career, I don't think I've run into any objection to my work that comes up as much as the idea of displacement and myths around displacement, that if we make one place better, everything's just going to go somewhere else. And so what we found, and there's nothing that's researched more in criminology, is that in fact, when you make a single place better, a lot of the crime associated with it just goes away, right? There is, of course, types of crime, right? There's some with more motivation that are going to move. Even they tend to be disrupted for a bit. So if you disrupt a narcotics market and somebody's addicted to opioids, they're not just going to go home and say, well, that's that, I guess I'm over it, right? They're going to go work hard to find somewhere else that they can go, but it may take some time to do that. But there's also lots of types of offenses, like two teenagers who may be arguing about what one said on social media, who happen to end up in the same spot on a Friday night and decide they're going to settle that physically, right? And if that place doesn't exist anymore in the way it did, then that assault may never happen. In fact, what we find through the research is a diffusion of benefits when we make a specific place, like an intersection or a park or individual address better, the places around it tend to get better in terms of crime and offending as well. And, all this informs crime prevention through environmental design. Next slide, John. And, we've got some links here that speak to additional elements around the intersection between crime and place. There's a law of crime concentration. We're all familiar with high impact offenders, in that about 20% of the people who commit crimes commit about 80% of crime. Well, the same holds true of places in which crime happens. About 80% of crime takes place in 20% of the places in which crime takes place. So we have, the corner store or alcohol establishment that attracts a lot of crime. And so if we can concentrate on those physical spaces, we may be able to have just as big an impact through an individual intervention as we can if we're able to identify and deal with an individual who's a high impact offender. We're learning a lot about the benefits of green spaces. There's a link to a podcast which did kind of an accidental study at Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago, found that in around individual towers where greenery was kept in place, crime was lower and mental health outcomes were better. We know from recent research that greening lots in urban spaces can reduce crime. We also know a lot of us learned a lot about how infectious disease spread over the past couple of years, but gun violence spreads in the same way geographically. So patterns of interaction between people has a geographic component to it. And also trying to think about how in specific spaces to operationalize collective advocacy, the idea, do I know my neighbors? Do I trust them? A way to measure that is by asking people, if you were in trouble, would your neighbors pick up the phone and call for help? And also social cohesion, the idea of, do I shop? Do I go to the local park? Do I go to the library in my neighborhood? Because we know in places where collective advocacy is higher, where you trust your neighbors and where you use local resources, social cohesion, all other things being equal, crime is lower. And so when you look at social cohesion in small towns or rural areas, kind of the challenge to social cohesion of everybody now shopping in a Walmart or discount outlet center rather than having a small main street that they can go to and interact. Next, John. And keeping up with kind of research around the importance of space and crime. The Center for Community Progress and Michigan Youth Violence Prevention Center put out a summary of evidence on greening vacant lots and its impact on crime. About 2 years ago, the John Jay Research and Evaluation Center out of New York put out a Reducing Violence Without Police research review, or what are the tools beyond police we can use to reduce violence. And the first suggestion was improving the physical environment, and LISC's own research about how development can impact crime. Next. So you're going to get another version of this. It's actually the same version, but you're going to hear it later on. But just what are the principles of CPTED? And the first three are commonly accepted, and you can find them in almost any discussion of what CPTED is. And the last three are more about my what I've learned in a 25-year career doing CPTED work. First principle is surveillance, and that's, can you be seen, and can you see what's around you? This can take many forms, but one of the things I always urge people interested in using CPTED as a strategy is not to confuse the tools for the principle, right? So when we talk about lighting, if we talk about cameras, it's not the cameras or the lighting that makes the difference. It's the ability to see and be seen. Access control, are people going to the places and in the routes that we want them to go or prefer that they go to? This can use hard barriers like fences, like doors, but it can also use persuasive techniques like how you use lighting to light walkways and pathways, how you do signage to direct people to certain areas. And territoriality, which is really reinforcing messaging around a continuum of space from fully public to semi-public to semi-private to private spaces, and making sure that your imagery is aligned with how you want a place to be used. I had 3A image and maintenance, especially for areas that are under control of central organization, so like a public housing development or a main street area, right? Making sure that you have consistent image and continuous maintenance of an area to reinforce the territoriality. Capable guardianship, who's in charge of an area, and is it obvious that somebody is in charge of an area, and whether or not you have policies and practices that back that up. Next, John. So the ultimate in CPTED technology, again, like surveillance everywhere, all territory defined and access controlled, and always it's good for control, but it's not so good for living. So in being part of a free society, we want to take those principles and use them in a way that really supports the type of community life we want. Remember the idea of building collective efficacy and social cohesion in our neighborhoods. Next, please. And reflecting back on my career in CPTED again, which started about 1996, 97, what we saw at that time when CPTED was a fairly new strategy, especially in a public context, was in order to prevent crime, there was a lot of emphasis on creating sterile spaces. Because if nothing could happen in a space, then nothing bad could happen in that space, right? And it didn't really recognized that legitimate uses of the space were a good defense against crime as much as any CPTED intervention. Let's see. Yeah, so this picture that you see on the right, I use it to remind me of working in the city of Hoboken. And this will be a lesson that's applicable, right? Not just in big cities, but in small towns and even rural areas. We were working at a housing development that was for retirees and disabled individuals, and every day in the morning, the older gentlemen of the tower would go outside and they'd take their tables out and card tables and chairs and start playing dominoes on the street. And the security guard who was working in the building, especially when the crime prevention people come, would shush them off and try and get them off the sidewalk. What he failed to recognize was the value of them in keeping an eye out for their neighborhood and filling that informal role of capable guardians, because everybody who walked down the street while these guys were playing dominoes was noted and noticed and talked to, right? They knew who belonged there. They said hello to the people who belonged there. They asked about the people who were new to the area. They were taking as active a role as anybody in helping create safe places around their neighborhood. So what we saw in CPTED was the development of second generation CPTED. And there's a program called Safe Growth we work with closely that takes it even further to kind of planning for community engagement with CPTED built in. But the idea is that you have to take into account the way people are living and want to use the space when you're thinking about CPTED interventions. CPTED interventions should be a problem solving tool. They're not a tool that exists outside of the local context. So first, what is your problem? And how do we fix it? And how do we use CPTED in fixing that? And what might be the wrong ways to use CPTED? And I find that a lot in lighting. When you make a place really bright at night, it can attract people as much as it lets you see what's going on. So making sure you're not accidentally creating a space for people to party in on a Wednesday or Thursday night because you lit it up so brightly that people nearby can't sleep, or that it's the place where people can go and be seen in ways that you're hoping they don't. And again, this fits in, a lot of this will sound like broken windows, but I want to make the point that broken windows policing, we've seen us over the years, and there's research to support the idea that broken windows policing has to fit into a community context or it doesn't work that well. Because we know that when police go into an area, even when they're concentrating on it, they're still just a part-time presence in a specific physical place. And the overall tone of the physical place is set by those who are there 24/7, right? So if you are pursuing CPTED as a component or as reflective of the broken windows philosophy, it really has to be driven by what the community sees as important. Otherwise, you're going to have these contradicting forces working, and the one that's going to end up winning is the one that is there 24/7, not part-time. Go ahead, John. Yeah, and again, surveillability, it's not just about lighting our cameras, it's about seeing and being seen. And examples of that, I like to use examples around like vegetation and the park that you see. It's in New York City, but I think it's applicable in many places, right? On the left, you see Bryant Park in New York, which was considered a very dangerous place. Nobody wanted to go there. Now it's been completely revitalized, in large part because of CPTED programming, which cut the branches up from lower parts of trees, remove vegetation. The wall at the left of the picture is bordering a street, so there's a sidewalk on the outside, so people walking by who can see into the park now when they couldn't before. And when you're in the park, you used to not be able to see across the park. You couldn't even see a few feet away from you. There could be people hiding on your right. There could be people hiding on your left, and you had no idea what that would be like, especially at night when it was dark inside. They cleared out the bushes on the central green which allowed an open field of view for everybody. And everybody in that park is now helping to keep an eye out for each other, right? And just by opening sightlines, it made a dramatic difference in how it feels to be there, right? And that feeling is very important, because when you don't feel safe, you don't go to a place, which leaves it vacant, which leaves it more vulnerable. And again, a note on CCTV: when you have a camera up, as a law enforcement agency, it might help to collect evidence, but if people are not actively monitoring and responding to what's happening on camera, the people in the neighborhood will figure out very quickly that it's not being watched. So it won't have it nearly as big a preventative effect as you might have. Next. Yeah, and again, remembering what are the principles. And so we see a street where tree trimming has taken place, but it forgot to take into account the nap of the earth, right? So the earth is rising, so the trees are trimmed up from the bottom, but not enough to account for the hill and the slope of the street. So remembering what is the principle when I do the work, and not just thinking about the tools of, oh, this is the tree trimming program, so let's do that. The idea is we have to open up visibility to the places that we want to see. Next, John. And again, access control and placemaking doesn't always have to be just about ordering people around. Placemaking can be a big part of how we create kind of that community-friendly CPTED intervention. Next, John. What you saw was a playground at a children's center, and instead of the signage reading private property, keep out, no admittance, this actually is a sign that was put up to invite people in to be partners in creating a child-friendly place in their neighborhood, and does so importantly for this city, Providence, Rhode Island, in both English and Spanish, because a lot of the people who live in the neighborhood primarily speak Spanish, right? And so the sign is saying, you are a partner in this, please contribute, instead of trying to order people in. Next. Yeah, one other thing about places is thinking about the context of place and time, right? So parks, for example, are very different places in daytime as they are at night. They may supposed to be empty at night, but you want to make sure you're taking into account, like, what is the nature of the place in different times, and how you respond to that. So on the left, you'll see a walking school bus. So for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, this sidewalk and neighborhood become a transit route to school. And so thinking about that as you're developing responses, and even special events. The top right is a race across Iowa, bike race across Iowa, RAGBRAI, that happens every summer. And it's thousands of cyclists descending on small towns and going throughout the state of Iowa. And essentially, it's a city that moves across the state for a whole month every summer, and thinking about what are the demands that places on a space in that time, which may just amount to a couple hours or even less. Next. Yeah, and so wayfinding, how do we send messages around what a place should be used for in a context that becomes positive for the community? And so you see maybe in your to improve the ability of people to use and look out for each other on a Main Street segment. If you just put out benches, can do some cheap public artwork, make a welcoming place to sit and be present, and help create eyes on the street through, like, tactical urbanism is a term that's used, and I think I use it in the next slide. Oh, territoriality. Thanks, John. Yeah, again, defining transitions of space, and there was a link earlier to talk about how greening can reduce crime in urban environments. This is the work of the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. They do this work in Philadelphia, where they clean and green and put ceremonial fencing, symbolic fencing around a lot. It's only about 2 feet high. It's not keeping able-bodied adults out at all, but it sends a message about whether the space is for you or not. Again, that marking that transition of fully public, so sidewalks or streets, to semi-public, the areas, grassy areas just off the sidewalk but outside the fence, to semi-private areas inside the fence. And private will often be marked by doors, windows, maybe the shrubbery you have just up against your house. But really sending these messages in ways that people recognize and respond to even without knowing it often. And just by being able to create spaces like this and maintain them, crime goes down in these areas. And next. Again, same type of intervention. Next. Capable guardianship. When I look at a place, do I know somebody is in charge of it or not? And for these pictures, the answer is resoundingly no. So if I'm looking to do something, maybe I'm looking to sell a little dope. Maybe I'm looking for a place where I can take my Percocet and chill out for a little while. This to me says, yeah, you belong here. So trying to come up with ways where we don't send this message of neglect. We don't send the message that the place is ignored and not cared for by anybody. Next. And again, lots of ways to send those types of messages that don't necessarily involve years-long planning processes or lots of money, right? We can change physical spaces just by often putting a table and a few people in them, right? Or finding temporary ways, even if we're going to do some more permanent changes to a physical space. And next. That's it for me. Hopefully I've introduced kind of some ideas and topics, and now I'll turn it over to our longtime friend and colleague, Tom Wyatt.
Thanks, Matt. All right, so we're going to dig a little bit deeper into CPTED. Just to, while we're doing that, just to give you a little background on myself, I am a consultant for LISC, where I really work in kind of CPTED alongside things like community development or community engagement and urban planning and other areas where they intersect. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper into CPTED and kind of explore where those things intersect as well. So again, when we're talking about CPTED or crime prevention through environmental design, we're talking about design and use of the built environment. And again, we're looking at reduction in fear of crime. I'm sure that a lot of you have experienced this. I was talking to somebody really recently from Billings, Montana, and they have about 100 homeless for their city of about 117,000. And people were saying the downtown was unsafe because of the visibility of the homeless, even though they didn't have the crime data. But also we look at the actual incidence of crime and just improvement of quality of life. And I think that's where you see things like what Matt referenced towards the end of his presentation, where there'd been improvements, because we're not just talking about safety, but we're talking about spaces functioning as they should, or reinventing spaces if that use is no longer viable. So when we're looking at CPTED, we're looking at how do we increase risk for offenders, as we saw in that triangle, and opportunities and the rewards, but also the vulnerability. And again, we look at this through changing the physical and social environment of places. And again, just to reiterate, these are the areas that we explore, and we'll kind of dig a little bit deeper into those as we go through the rest of the presentation. So a lot of CPTED can really blends into anything. So as Matt shared, there's some landscaping things, there's lighting, but it can even be proactive. There are cities that have zoning ordinances and CPTED ordinances that, similar to during the site plan review process, that's a part of it, looking at if something is being constructed or modified, is it going to create something that could attract crime or could increase vulnerability for people. Looking at things like changes in traffic patterns. We also look at beyond that, we look at how color can affect human behavior. So I was on a grant where we did CPTED assessments in schools, and we looked at the paint colors and the art and how it impacted things like bullying. So we're not necessarily getting into outright criminal behavior, but it is a dangerous behavior nonetheless. Also restroom design, where different activities can happen, even looking at things like terrorism and public transportation. So when we get into CPTED, we really look at two things from a design stage. We look at how are we controlling access and how are we enabling surveillance of a space. And really, there's these three areas or three aspects. There's the organized, where it's basically people powered; mechanical, where it's some type of technological, even if it's something like a fence, that was a technology that was developed. And then natural, just like Matt said, the trimming of trees in Bryant Park. And those things can be applied for both access control and spatial. And we really encourage people to look at the natural first. And so the reason for that is because it's cheaper. It costs money to pay people to add more police or security. It costs money to modify or install technology in buildings and places. But it doesn't cost as much resources to have maintenance come in and trim back stuff once a year, or to remove something so that once and for all it's not an impediment to visibility or opens up access. And so from there, then we kind of season this. So I would say CPTED is not a cure-all, but what it is really it's a process, where you start with the natural if you can, and then you start to get into the more costly things like mechanical interventions and organized interventions of people, and see where you end up when you start with the natural, and where you need to kind of season your strategies with mechanical organized strategies. So another thing we want to pick, I think Matt hinted at, was this notion of environmental cues. And so here we've got an image of a largely boarded up row house with some overgrowth. And criminals look at this as similar to how we would look at, when we're shopping for something, or we're looking at what to invest our retirement savings in. We're looking at safe or risky. And criminals are looking at the environment in the same way. Is this a safe spot for me to, as Matt said, kind of chill out and take my Percocet? Or is this an unsafe space because there's people and I might be, seen, or someone might call me out and move me along? And so criminals recognize these, and that's where we start to see, crime hotspots emerge. So when we look at natural surveillance, we're looking at how do people kind of see, without obstruction, how is lighting add to that, whether it's illumination or adding glare or shadows, or how are buildings creating entrapment areas? For instance, when I was in California, we were doing our assessment at the University of Southern California, and my group was tasked with the library, and we observed that the ADA entrance was this kind of winding path on the back side of the library that took you sub-level, and then it was very hard to get out of, and then you rang a doorbell and then waited for a librarian who may be in that area to answer. That would be an entrapment point. And so we look at things like that, but we also look at how people are getting around and how people are seen. So a couple of examples that we pulled from one of your partners in this program. This is over in Oneida. And so you can see that, around the corner on the upper left-hand image, you can't really see if somebody is on the other side of that. So whether they are friend or foe, you're going to be surprised nonetheless. Same thing with some of these other images. There can be, you don't know necessarily what's happening behind there, or sometimes depending on your climate, you may have homeless encampments or activity happening inside the kind of thick of the vegetation. We also look at the design. So, this stairway, you can see that you can see through. So the stairs, the treads and the risers are not there so that you can see through. And so when you're coming through there, you can see if someone's on either side of that. When we look at this alleyway, we can see that there's a good amount of windows. And so again, that's an environmental cue. Even if somebody is considering something, there's a high likelihood of being seen. In contrast with the images on the bottom where you have very few windows, And there's a possibility that you could experience, maybe higher break-ins at the cars, or have other activity. And so we think about those things with surveillance as well. And then we look at windows. So you can see, the lower images, you can see that these shrubs are overgrown. And so you necessarily wouldn't see if somebody's hiding on the porch waiting to ambush you. And then a lot of these, when you look at the windows, you can't really see in. And so there's a high risk for offenders because they don't know if they're being observed, because the glare is reflecting what's outside. And so whether the people inside it know it or not, they're effectively acting as surveillance for the space. And hopefully if they see something, they're going to say something. So when we think of access control, we're thinking about how do we guide people to a site, and that can involve things like streets, entrances, and landscaping. And so in this image, real quickly here, you can see that there's hedgerows, there's some low fencing, and there's a clearly identifiable path. And part of this is to make it hard, for people to take alternate routes. It really eliminates the need in some cases for cameras in areas, because if people can't traverse certain areas because there's not pathways and it's very difficult to kind of get through, then you can focus most of your surveillance and visibility on the areas where you've created access control and pathways. It also helps people to stand out. So if an individual was in an area that, walking around in one of these areas where there wasn't a pathway, they would look odd, and people would start to observe them and wonder what's going on. Here's a couple other examples that you might see in your community. Again, fencing, hedges, separating out property lines, creating a area for these businesses where you can walk up that's attractive, kind of discourages people cutting through the hillside where the mulch and the flowers are. Even thinking about how do you limit people from getting up on with their vehicles. You've got on the bottom left, these probably bollards underneath these planters to reduce the risk of somebody driving their car up there, and just really kind of creating separation. And then on the bottom right, you've got anti-climb fence. And so if we were to zoom in on that image, you would see that it's very hard to get a foothold or a handhold in there. And so you have high visibility and low likelihood of somebody being able to scale that pretty easily unless they're really skilled at climbing. A couple others that you see, vegetation can be a good use. If it's thorny or it's thick, it can prohibit that. It can also prohibit people from like tagging buildings. If you're able to, put that up against an area, it prevents the aerosol from getting close enough to the building to create the effect that the artist is trying to do, or the person tagging the building is, because it disperses before it hits the building. But then you can also use natural things like these stones. And then a couple other examples for access control. So we've got the Sandy Hook School. First of all, you've got lots of windows for surveillance, but you've got these pathways that are kind of winding in different ways that kind of slow people down, but it also maintains that attractive look that can be used. And so the steps in the area could be used as an amphitheater of sorts, but it really limits somebody's ease of getting onto the property. But they also want to look at natural things. And so you want to look at where there are worn paths, like in this park, where maybe there should be a sidewalk and where maybe there should be some cleaning up of the sight lines, because people are naturally choosing that way to enter the park instead of going to the preferred or designated entrances. And then, just sometimes we think about, we miss these things too. So this is a school in Oneida that we saw. There's fencing sporadically. So fencing's great unless there's an entrance, in different places. And so somebody could enter at different points. There could be fencing from a corner, but then you walk up to the driveway and then you see that the fencing is stopped. And so the fencing is not as effective at controlling access. So we look at territoriality. This is, again, using physical attributes to show ownership. And so it could be things like this wayfinding sign. Those are hugely important in public spaces because it helps people move around. If you've ever been lost, you're kind of stopped and looking around. But if you have good wayfinding and lots of visibility, and people can tell that they're in a designated space, they know how to move around. And it also helps to identify people who may be up to, they may be looking to commit some type of crime. And so it helps to identify those individuals as well. So a couple examples of that could be just public art. You've got the ice rink, and so they've got public art adjacent to that, or just fencing showing that, this is a multifamily property, but on the other side, it's the public realm or semi-public realm where you can walk. But once you cross in, now you're in people's their backyards and their neighborhood. But again, we got some wayfinding examples. But also you could add painted items on the roadways to indicate when you're entering different districts, or to use it to slow traffic. If you've got, say like a children's museum, you may find these types of things to indicate, hey, this is a different kind of space, and you may need to be more aware of your surroundings. So when we're talking about CPTED, we're not just talking about people who are looking to commit crimes, but even people who may be unintentionally committing crimes through speeding or carelessness, and things that are not necessarily kind of the more prevalent crimes that we think of when we think about public safety. And then here's a local example. I work in Flint, Michigan. And so this was a former grocery store that burnt down, and it was left with the kind of grocery store floor and the parking lot. And it was a hangout for a lot of homeless and transient population. And so actually the homeless shelter raised money to build a park here for the neighborhood. They didn't have a park. And so it was kind of abandoned. And so as Matt said, if it seems like there's no ownership, then it's very inviting. It tells that person that I can belong here. Now anybody belongs there, but there's a different type of behavior that occurs at this park now that it's maintained and has programming. So when we look at CPTED, there's really kind of 4 different strategies that we think about. In your community, you may have something a space that functioned in one way, but the business closed, or the park no longer has the same type of amenities, or whatever it might be. So you may have to think about, how do we redesignate that space to provide natural barriers to conflicting activities, thinking about the borders, thinking about how people move from different parts of the space, from like the public side of the space to the private space, but also just scheduling, and also who owns it, and how do people contact the people that are using that space. And this is a good diagram of just those transition zones. And so you've got the public realm, which includes the sidewalk and the street. And then once you enter into someone's yard, you're kind of in the semi-public, but once you're up on their property, on their porch, you're in the private realm. And so that's what we're talking about when we reference these things. So maintenance, here's what we're looking at for maintenance. Lots of overgrowth and things that, again, hinder things like who owns this? Is this, if no one cares for this property, then maybe they also won't care if I commit these types of offenses in the neighborhood. Maybe this is a good neighborhood to open, I'll rent this house and start running a drug house out of it, and so on. And so really we want to, allow for the continued use of the space for its intended purpose, make places look like they are owned and well maintained, and eliminate any type of cues that tell criminals that this is a good target for harmful behavior and activities. Here's a couple examples from Flint in terms of maintenance. So this is a trail system, our first trail, the Flint River Trail, that came about. And it's, before it was very unattractive. You wouldn't want to walk down this because, again, you didn't know what was going on. You're walking on the road. So the university I worked for went in and trimmed the trees up, and then they were able to put a dedicated path with pedestrian and auto stop signs. And you can see that where it leads, you've got a good amount of visibility, so you can perceive whether somebody is a friend or foe as you're approaching them. Here's another example. So you couldn't see what you're coming around to the parking lot, and now you can open up and you could see what's going on down there. This is more of the trail. You can see somebody is either living in or has abandoned a vehicle. And so imagine kind of walking and stumbling across that and not knowing that that's there. And now that's fully open and you can see for hundreds of yards down the path. So we look at capable guardianship. there are three different types of people that kind of are involved in community, not just from CPTED, but we look at them through these areas in CPTED. So your normal users are people that, belong in that space. They live there, they work there, they play there, whatever that might be. And then observers are, people like law enforcement or security and others. And then abnormal users are people you don't want to be in the space. And so you're thinking of people that are potentially casing a neighborhood for breaking and entering, or setting up drug trafficking in a certain part of the neighborhood, and different things. And then we also look at social management. So CPTED wouldn't be successful in communities if it wasn't for people. It's really a people-powered program. And that includes, different levels of government, organizations, property owners, and just the general public. So a couple things to think about with partnership, in anything with when we're looking at problems with crime, there is an aspect of our strategies that involves stabilization before we can see really healthy, vibrant things happening in spaces again. We've got to stabilize that. And I often liken that to farming. You don't just put a crop, a seed into the ground and expect it to grow. You've got to cultivate that soil. And that's what the CPTED work is. It's really about stabilization that leads to that revitalization. And so, and depending on where your community is, you may have certain things that you'd love to see in your community. And you just don't feel like it's inviting or attractive enough for those things. That's where you get into the stabilization work, and that involves, the place that you're targeting, the resources that you have available, whether it's knowledge or funds to implement things, the people that are involved, and also importantly, the programming, because we just don't build something and hope that people are going to utilize it, but we want to be thinking about, okay, if we've improved this space, how do we ensure that it's used in a way that is successful and healthy and in line with the community's vision? And that often leads to the revitalization. So we look at partnership as an investment. And so CPTED is just one of a number of strategies that your community might be involved in. You might have social services of different types, or maintenance programs, or home repair programs at your city, or different organizations that are helping people. And the whole goal is to at least get to a stable point. But when we were doing this work in Flint, we thought, is it really a success? It is if we have lower crime. But what if we also have other things going on at the same time? And so that's where CPTED really kind of hit us and really got us buying in on CPTED, was that we were seeing empowerment of residents, and as we were fixing up different things, other people were fixing up properties. People were more open to coming out and socializing. Neighborhoods started to rebound. We saw less disorder. We saw more economic development happening in our community. And we saw people having pride in place and wanting to stay there versus thinking about, what other community could I move to that might be less problematic? And so I'm not going to go through these, but there's a lot, and you'll get these slides. There's a lot of different sectors that can be involved in CPTED, from arts and culture to the faith community to real estate to universities and colleges. And there's a lot of opportunities. And so in some cases, you can have people that can get trained to do the assessments, or sometimes you can have people that have resources like foundations or businesses that might sponsor, implementation of CPTED. When we do the assessments, we often look at them like home inspections. You get a list of different things that, could be implemented. And there's a cost associated with those things, or whether it's, material or labor. And so sometimes you can find people that might be willing to sponsor those. Again, Billings told me that they have a program where they have $30,000 a year allocated from the city budget for CPTED improvements. If you get an assessment in certain districts of the downtown, you can have a 1-to-1 match on the cost of implementing those things. So there's lots of different ways to engage partnerships to implement CPTED. And There's lots of different, different kind of examples of those partnerships, whether maybe you have an area that's not as well used. And so maybe you partner with food trucks to have a Food Truck Friday event, or maybe you have organized service days with a club or an organization, and you target those spaces. Or maybe you are engaged with the city in tactical urbanism and tactical placemaking, as Matt showed, where the city wants to explore different things, but there's a cost, and so they want to use temporary materials to explore possible solutions and engage with the community to see how they react to these temporary things before they look at permanency. So a couple, flyers we had for our CPTED strategies that we had a bike patrol where we utilized the AmeriCorps and the campus police. They also started a reading program in apartment community as an engagement strategy. They also patrolled the trail. This image on the bottom, I think, is from our friends at LISC, where the cops had some events in the community, but also looking at how you can reuse space. In the upper right-hand corner, taking a vacant lot and creating an area where different types of raised bed gardens and fruit could grow to help with food insecurity in the community, and just makes a lot of inroads in the community. So putting it all together, when we did this in Flint, we were part of a 3-year grant, very similar to kind of the rural crime strategies, and we were operating from 2014 or so to 2018. So this was a point in time where we're looking at this, but we did see significant decreases in property that was blighted. We saw an increase in people participating. We've since looked at the investment, and we're close to about 350 million in this area, where initially was these public safety strategies that leaned heavily on CPTED. We're seeing new housing development, we're seeing home repair and full code rehab, and we're seeing multifamily, and we're seeing new parks. The area is receiving its first state park for the city. But also crime went down, almost 50% in assaults. Same thing with robberies, burglary, and vandalism. All of these things went down largely through our CPTED strategies. And that's my part of the presentation. So I'll hand it back over to John and Matt.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate that informative discussion, and welcome questions. I don't see any yet in the chat or Q&A box. So I also welcome Matt to join the discussion if he has questions, and same for Samantha and Juliana. If you have any follow-up comments or questions for the presenters, we welcome that. I will also take the opportunity while we're waiting for any questions to come in to note that, as previously stated, we will follow up with attendees with a copy of this presentation deck. So you'll have that for reference, and we will also put a recording of today's presentation on the LISC website as soon as possible. And so I will pause there to see if we have any questions. At the moment, I don't.
John, I've got a question.
Please.
I appreciate the presentation, such great information, and so logical when you really drill down into it. It makes perfect sense. Are you seeing more and more jurisdictions and community partners seek to implement CPTED principles? And what has that shift been like in the last 5 or so years when you're working in the field? Just because, again, it makes such good sense that you work through all of these different elements and principles to address different crime challenges.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that, John.
Please go ahead, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing in a lot of places is the CPTED and environmental approaches are being used to help create more of a holistic response to crime, in that we can't just rely on police to do everything because they're overworked and stretched too thin. So how do I, as a normal citizen, or especially in our case, we often work with community groups. As a community group, what is my role in creating a safer environment or a safer neighborhood? And a really solid, simple yet effective entry point to that is a place-based approach. Identify the places in your neighborhood that contribute to crime or disorder or feelings of being unsafe, and make changes to those places. And it's also a really good entry point, I think, for police departments that are looking at how can we get more into community partnerships, and partner with community groups and develop this practice of working together. Focusing on physical spaces can remove some of the tension that might come with focusing on people in the neighborhood. So for police departments, it can be a great way to improve their community outreach efforts and practice building those community partnerships.
Yeah, and it lightens the load a little bit too, because you see other people involved in CPTED. So the city may be heavily involved through the police, but then they may bring in the planning department or people from building or public health. And so it's not just all on the police.
And I see Tom put in a great link to the US CPTED Association. I can include that link in the follow-up email, Tom, along with a few other resources that Matt and Tom have put together, some from LISC, some from other sources that talk about additional opportunities to think through placemaking, CPTED, and really honing in on that relationship between place and crime. I don't believe I see any other questions in the chat or the Q&A, but we're happy to hang on here for just a few more minutes, and please do use the Q&A feature or the chat feature to enter in questions. And again, welcome Juliana or Samantha. If you have any additional follow-up comments or questions, we're happy to take those as well.
No additional comments from me, John, just that thank you all on the LISC team for that wonderful presentation. And again, thank you to the RVCR grantees who were able to join us today.
Yeah, I echo that. I will thank our presenters now. I will thank Samantha for her partnership as providing training and technical assistance, and of course Juliana's support at the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We have a few comments that were simply thanks, appreciate that. We'll hold on here for just a few more moments to see if we have any further questions, or we can end a bit early. I guess to follow up on Juliana's comment, are there additional trends or challenges that you've seen over the last couple of years, Tom and Matt, that you would like to note from a place and crime and CPTED perspective? Could be community police partnership, could be community engagement, could be other pieces. Any further comments there or insights?
Yeah, I think the one thing to watch out for is when you're talking about CPTED in a community context, it often conflicts with especially first generation CPTED training, which will focus on target hardening. So for example, if you have an officer who's trained in that type of CPTED and wants people to secure their businesses better and everything, you have to be careful about kind of the overall community message that you're sending, because if every shop on a street has bars on the windows, that may make each individual shop safer, but it tends to make the street much less safe. So taking in the community context beyond just the individual target hardening is very important.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of the things I hear, I start to pick up on a lot of what people are hoping for transcends public safety. It's really thinking about what the community was like either in its earlier days, could be like 1920s, could be 60s, not necessarily like culturally, but where there's vibrancy, where there are different amenities, and people see public safety issues as hindrances to things like the economic vitality. And we hear this, I think we heard this after 2016, we heard a lot of conversations in the rural communities about people leaving for cities and because of opportunity. And so I think there's a lot more conversations I'm hearing from people about, I want my community to be safe because I want it to be a community that my children can choose to stay in, or they find opportunity, or they find fulfillment, or it's welcoming to people that want to come into my community. And so there's a lot of interconnection when people are talking about these things. And so I see that a lot. And now we see a lot about, there's a lot of talk about schools in safety. That's a trend we're hearing more, not just active shooters, but just kind of safety in general, whether it's physical violence from, student to student and so on.
Well, I think that's the last word, Tom. We're right at 3 o'clock Eastern. So I just want to say thank you again, Tom. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate the partnership and the presentation today, and want to thank all of our Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative grantees for joining us today. We'll follow up with the deck and the survey. And with that, we stand adjourned, and thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.